sacrificed to Ashtoreth. Baal represented the nation's turning away from God and to the physical, the material, the carnal, and the sensual. It was this that opened the door for the entrance of Ashtoreth, or Ishtar, and with it, unbridled sexuality, licentiousness, and decadence. The worship of Baal had elements of all these things, but Ashtoreth was their incarnation. The one god ushered in the other, and the one spirit the next. The god of the apostasy ushered in the goddess of sexual licentiousness and debauchery. Ishtar comes to America. What would this mean for America and the West? If America's turning from God began to manifest in the early 1960s, and, with it, the entrance of Baal, we would then expect this to be followed by the entrance of Ashtoreth or Ishtar. And what would then happen in the wake of that entrance? We would expect a transformation to begin that would alter the realm of sexuality. With the goddess's entrance, we would expect biblical standards and ethics surrounding sexuality and marriage to begin to erode. We would expect the moral foundations and values that had undergirded Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years to begin overturning. In short, we would expect there to be a revolution in the realm of sexuality, a sexual revolution. Ishtar and the sexual revolution. And that is exactly what took place. Shortly after America's turning from God began manifesting in the early 1960s, another transformation took place in the realm of sexuality. It would be one of the central defining movements of the 1960s, and it would continue long after the decade was over. It would not stop until it had transformed American and Western culture beyond recognition. The effect of the goddess's return to America could be summed up in 3 words: the sexual revolution. There had been another sexual revolution. It took place in ancient times in the Greco-Roman world. It was the revolution by which biblical sexual ethics, ideals, and morality replaced those of the pagan world. It happened at the same time the gods were cast out of Western civilization. The two phenomena were connected. The casting out of the gods included the casting out of the Roman Venus, the Greek Aphrodite, the Phoenician Astarte, and the Mesopotamian Ishtar, all the varied manifestations of the goddess of sexuality. It was in the goddess's departure that biblical values replaced pagan ones, and the first sexual revolution took place. But if the goddess should return, it would mean that pagan sexual values would now overturn biblical ones. In other words, the sexual revolution that took place in America and Western civilization in the late 20th century was the reversing of the sexual revolution that took place in ancient times. It was the advent of the gospel that broke the goddess's spell. But now, upon her return, the spell would be cast again on America, the West, and the world. The spell of the sorceress. The sexual revolution was another dimension of the paganization of America and Western civilization. The values it represented were pagan values, and the sexuality was pagan sexuality. What was branded as the new morality was in actuality an old morality, an ancient morality, the morality of the gods. The reappearance of that morality was a sign that the departed spirits had returned to the house. The aim of the goddess was to destroy the morality and faith by which she was expelled. To do that, she would have to take a Christian nation and civilization that, with regard to sexuality and marriage, upheld biblical morality and practices, and lead it into embracing pagan morality and practices. To do that, as with the return of Baal, she would have to work incrementally, step by step, and progressively. But it was the spirit of Ishtar, and to Ishtar especially belonged the powers of seduction and spells. So in recasting her ancient spell, she would begin the seduction of America and the modern world. What would it mean if America were to come under the spell of an ancient goddess? Chapter 19. The Great Seduction. What exactly would happen if the spirit of the goddess took possession of a culture? What would happen if it took possession of America? And then came Ishtar. In the American and Western culture of the mid-20th century, sexuality was seen as the sacred domain of marriage, and marriage as the sacred and lifelong covenant of love between a husband and wife. These values were largely the same as they had been in ancient times at the advent of Christianity. Sex outside of marriage, whether premarital or extramarital, was seen as sin. Divorce was frowned upon. If a woman became pregnant before marriage, she and the child's father were expected to marry. The divorce rate was minuscule. So was the percentage of people living together outside of marriage, as was the rate of children born out of wedlock. Prostitution existed but was illegal and confined to the underworld. Pornography was taboo, and for the most part kept out of mainstream culture and public view. Even those who broke such standards would, for the most part, keep their behavior private. American entertainment and popular culture were expected to uphold the same values. Beyond allusion and suggestion, sexual relations were generally not depicted on the movie screen. Hollywood was expected to follow an agreed-upon code of morality as to what could and could not be shown, and it did. Nudity of any kind was forbidden. Any allusion to sex outside of marriage was not to be portrayed in a positive light, and for television screens the parameters were even tighter. And then came Ishtar. The deification of sex. We have seen the dynamic of deification. When an individual, nation, or civilization turns away from God, that which is not God will become as God and will assume the aura of godhood. One of those things that are not God is sex. When Israel turned away from God, sex, in the form of the goddess Ashtoreth or Ishtar, was deified. Sex became a god. Sex thus became an end and a goal to be pursued in and of itself. Therefore, it could now be divorced from marriage or any other context and be followed with no regard for context or any other thing. When the spirit of Ishtar came to America, the same dynamics began to replay. Sexuality was deified. It became a god to be pursued, as an end in and of itself and without regard to marriage, love, or even a relationship. That which was once the exclusive domain of husband and wife now spilled into the public sphere and popular culture. And so began the progressive severing of sexuality from marriage. As Israel worshipped and served the goddess of sexuality, so now America, indwelled by the same spirit and the same goddess, became increasingly obsessed with sex. The destruction of marriage. Though Ishtar was involved in the ritualized marriage ceremonies of Mesopotamian religion, and though some of her myths involved a form of marriage, there was almost nothing about her that was conducive to marriage. Just the opposite. Her nature and acts, her worship and cult, would undermine it. She was never faithful. She was promiscuous. She pursued and seduced lover after lover. She pursued sexual relations apart from marriage and to the detriment of marriage. So the effect of Ishtar's return to the modern world was the progressive undermining and weakening of marriage. As sexuality was glorified as an end in and of itself, marriage was eroded. As Ishtar had pursued relationship after relationship, so America began doing the same. As the taboo against ending one's marriage began to end, so did marriages. Under the spirit of Ishtar, divorce became an epidemic, and America was filled with broken homes. Passions of the Goddess. Ishtar was led only by her will and desires. She had no regard for the consequences of her actions. The idea of denying her desires for the sake of a covenant was to her an anathema. She sought the immediate fulfillment of every impulse. She was the goddess of instant gratification. So with the return of Ishtar, American and modern culture became consumed with instant gratification. Americans increasingly chose their desires over relationships, over preserving their marriages or entering into them in the first place. A culture of hyper-individualism, self, and self-gratification proved to be toxic to marriage and relationships. As it was Ishtar's nature to choose sexual pleasure and romance over commitment, more and more Americans did likewise. They slept with each other, lived with each other, but would not commit to each other. Marriage, as a lifelong covenant, was increasingly viewed as an unnecessary constraint. What was once fornication now became premarital relations, and in time, the norm. The number of Americans living together without marriage and the number of children born out of wedlock or without fathers would skyrocket. Ishtar in Hollywood. The realms of entertainment and popular culture were subject to the same spirit. The codes and standards that had been established to serve as moral hedges were now removed. What was once forbidden, abhorrent, or taboo now filled movie screens. And whereas the television industry once avoided showing married couples in bed, now it regularly portrayed unmarried people in bed and having sex with multiple partners. And whereas nudity was once never seen in public, it was now displayed on movie screens and piped into American living rooms. If Americans from the 1950s had turned on their television sets to see what would appear on the nation's television sets years into the future, they would not have been able to process it. It would have appeared to them as something out of the apocalypse or a dark fever dream. That was how radically effective the work of the goddess had been. The taboo. Ishtar's nature was to trespass boundaries, transgress convention, and break taboos. So American culture became possessed by a spirit of transgression, a drive to push the next boundary, to transgress the next convention, to break the next taboo. What was once abhorrent now became a source of pleasure, and it was not only the taking of pleasure in sin, but in the breaking of taboos and the overturning of the next standard. It was the pleasure of defilement and desecration. Not only did Ishtar introduce, promulgate, and champion sexual immorality, she sanctified it. She declared it holy. Sexually immoral acts were part of her cult and worship, performed as rites in her temples and shrines. So in the grip of her spirit, the same thing began manifesting in American and Western culture. Sexual immorality was now not only accepted, but treated as sacred. Sanctifying the forbidden. Now it was the former standards and restraints that were seen as sinful, puritanical, repressive, and evil. And the one who opposed the newly sanctified sins or failed to adequately revere them was now treated as something of a heretic, and the opposition to the new morality as something akin to blasphemy. What the spirit of Baal had begun, the spirit of Ashtoreth or Ishtar had taken to another level. The work of each god was to bring about the inversion of civilization. Ishtar had inverted the realm of sexuality. She had taken what was forbidden, unspoken, and taboo, and step by step introduced it into the mainstream culture. The shock of each step would be followed by familiarity and numbness, then toleration, then acceptance, and then celebration. At the end of the process, Americans would be championing what they had once forbidden and forbidding what they had once championed. Ishtar's realm was most critical. It was from sexuality that came marriage, family, society, civilization, and life. And so the workings of the goddess would produce the most profound of transformations in American, Western, and world civilization. She would alter them beyond recognition. She would alter life itself. Could that which now saturates the world of entertainment, drives major portions of the American economy, and floods the World Wide Web, go back to a mystery contained in the tablets of ancient Mesopotamia? Chapter 20. The Sacred Prostitute. Ishtar was the patron goddess of prostitutes. She was their protector, their encourager, their supporter, their guide, and their matron. From the ladies of the night who walked the streets of Sumer to the sacred prostitutes who inhabited the shrines and temples of Babylonia, they all looked to Ishtar, prayed to her, worshipped her, and were her servants. Prostitution was a part of her cult. Sexual acts attended her worship and rituals and could be found in her sanctuaries. The temples of Ishtar were famous for their connection to prostitutes, and even for the business of prostitution. The connection was intrinsic to the goddess's identity. The Harlot Goddess. Ishtar was not only the great benefactor of prostitutes, but their role model. Her obsession with sexuality, her promiscuity, her countless relationships and lovers, all of these served as examples for the ancient Middle Eastern prostitute. In the tablets of Sumer, Ishtar, or her earlier incarnation as Inanna, is described as a harimtu or karkid. The words are commonly translated as prostitute. Some argue that the words can mean prostitute, but not necessarily in every context. But the words appear in descriptions of Ishtar, where the context clearly refers to prostitution, specifically when it cites the tavern, the place where prostitutes gathered and worked. One ancient hymn says this: "They cannot compete with you, Inanna, Ishtar. As a prostitute, you go down to the tavern, and like a ghost who slips in through the window, you enter there." And from another: "You, my lady, dress like one of no repute in a single garment." As the ancient Mesopotamian prostitute could be identified by her jewelry, so too Ishtar. The pearls of a prostitute are placed around your neck. Another ancient tribute to the goddess is even more detailed, as it deals with the pricing of her trade. When I stand against the wall, it is 1 shekel. Another ancient inscription has the goddess saying outright, I am a prostitute. The sexualization of American culture. The return of Ishtar was the return of the prostitute goddess. It would set in motion a transformation based on the dynamics of her trade as well as her cult of worship. Prostitution takes sexual relations out of the exclusive context of husband and wife and brings them into the larger culture, into the marketplace, the realm of trade and commerce. Likewise, Ishtar's cult of worship took sexuality out of the private realm of the marriage covenant and into the public realm of festivals, rituals, and temple worship. So when the spirit of Ishtar returned to Western civilization, it worked toward removing sexuality from the bounds of marriage. Sexuality now moved out of the private realm and into the public realm. What had once been the exclusive possession of husband and wife within the covenant of marriage now became the possession of the larger culture, popular culture, and public life. So American and Western culture became sexualized. Its sexuality had been stolen from the marriage bed. Sexuality was now everywhere and unbridled by the covenant of marriage. The harlot's pay. It was not only that Ishtar's prostitutes would take sexuality out of the marriage bed and into the streets of Sumer and Akkad, they would bring it into the marketplace. They converted it into a commodity to be bought and sold. In prostitution, sex was employed as a means of procuring money. So upon her return, not only did the prostitute goddess flood the culture with sexuality, but she increasingly employed it in the marketplace as a commodity. Sex would increasingly be used to procure money, on movie screens, in music videos, in magazines, on the internet, and wherever else it could generate money. What the spirit of Ishtar had promoted in the cities of Mesopotamia, it now promoted in America and world culture. Sex was monetized. The pornification of culture. It was not only that sex was used to sell other commodities, but, as in Ishtar's ancient craft, sex itself was up for sale. Industries that had existed in the shadows now entered the American and Western mainstream and were normalized. Adult magazines, adult clubs, adult movies, adult entertainment increased in numbers and influence. One no longer had to venture into the corners and shadows of American life. The shadows were overtaking America. The tablets of ancient Mesopotamia contain inscriptions in which the goddess seeks to tempt her lovers into sexual relations. They will not be quoted from here, as they could best be described as pornographic literature. So, as the spirit of the goddess increasingly took hold of American and Western culture, pornographic literature and storylines began entering into the mainstream. As the ancient Mesopotamians read or listened to the pornographic words and stories of Ishtar, Americans now read pornographic literature and watched pornographic movies in theaters, on their television sets, and on their computer monitors. And as prostitution depersonalized sexuality, so the spirit of the prostitute goddess increasingly depersonalized sexuality. Mother of Eros. The newly mainstreamed sex industries would employ and be known by the word erotic, erotic literature, erotic dancers, erotic massages, erotic movies, erotica. The word erotic comes from the word eros. Eros was the ancient god of the Greeks. The name means desire. Eros was the god of sexual desire and love. Eros was born of Aphrodite. Aphrodite was the Greek incarnation of Ishtar. So behind the name given to describe the deluge that was sweeping over American and world culture was the pagan god Eros. And behind Eros was Ishtar. Behind it all was Ishtar. Having returned to the modern world, the goddess had again given birth to Eros. The images. The worship of Ishtar was not limited to pornographic literature or storylines. It found its most popular expression in imagery. The image of Ishtar as a naked woman could be found all over the ancient Middle East in terracotta reliefs, royal seals, and clay idols. Images of naked women were typical of pagan culture and especially prominent in the worship of Ishtar. Thus, we might expect that the entrance of Ishtar into America and modern culture would bring a revival of naked imagery, and that is exactly what took place. Naked images, particularly those of women, would again permeate Western civilization. In the modern case, it would be known as pornography. In ancient times, Ishtar caused images of naked women to spread throughout the Middle Eastern world in clay, stone, and paint. Now, upon her return, she began causing the same images to permeate the modern world in photographs, films, video clips, and digital imagery. The images and practices that once characterized the culture of the goddess now characterized American culture. The porn goddess. Among the oldest writings in world history are the sacred hymns to Ishtar, Inanna, in which she is described as a prostitute. The Greek word for writing is graphos. The Greek word for Ishtar's profession, prostitution, is porne. It is from this root, writings about a prostitute, that we get the word pornography. Thus, by the literal definition of the word, pornography was birthed in the sacred writings of the goddess. And so, as the spirit of the prostitute goddess moved upon America, America became filled with pornography, or, as it was called in short, porn, meaning in effect, the prostitute. American culture, entertainment, and American-produced internet made pornography ubiquitous. It was everywhere. Americans no longer had to go into the red light district of American cities and towns to obtain pornographic materials. American culture had now become a red light district. Ishtar had triumphed. Her effect on America was so great that it had now become the world's leading creator and exporter of pornography. America was now, in fact, producing the majority of the world's pornographic content. It had become the undisputed porn capital of the world. The civilization that had been consecrated at its inception to advancing the gospel and spreading the light of God to the nations was covering the earth with pornography and advancing the agenda of another spirit, that which now controlled it, that of the prostitute goddess. What do sex, drugs, and rock and roll, fortune tellers and witchcraft, intoxication, New Age movements, and the world of the occult have to do with one another? They all go back to the enchantments of a Mesopotamian goddess. Chapter 21. The Intoxicator. As an enchantress, Ishtar tempted, allured, and captivated. She caused her followers to abandon reason and rationality to do what they otherwise would never have done. She cast spells, she worked magic. Thus her ability to seduce was all the more potent. Ishtar's Potion. As the goddess who dwelled in taverns, Ishtar was strongly connected to the substances of intoxication served and partaken of there. In one of her myths, she schemes to